Good evening. I'm Timothy Pugh, a board member of the New York Society of the American Institute of Archaeology, and welcome to the 2025 Brush Lecture, and also happy Chinese New Year. The AIA is North America's largest and oldest archaeological organization with nearly 200,000 members worldwide. If you, it supports a number of things. It supports archaeologists, whether in the field or you know, in the office. It supports educators, funds excavations for scholars and for students, publications, research, and site preservation. Um, with an AIA membership, you receive a subscription to Archaeology magazine, which is it has some nicely written articles, also nice pictures in there. You can also experience AIA firsthand, or get archaeological experience with AIA firsthand. You can participate in lectures on the latest research as you're doing today. You can also participate in archaeological field work, whether survey or excavations, even some lab work, and visit sites as part of AIA tour. And actually, if you're friends of the AIA of New York, you get special tours, which today they're going to I believe, the Met to do a special tour there. Okay. The Society's 225 Brush Lecture will be presented by Professor Lawrence Waldron, an Assistant Professor of Art History at Queens College. Professor Waldron holds an MFA in illustration from the School of Visual Arts and a PhD in Pre-Columbian Art and Architecture from the Graduate School and University Center of CUNY. And he is just now finishing his third book, which is very impressive. The 2016 book, Handbook of Ceramic Animal Symbols in the Ancient Lesser Antilles, cataloged and interpreted zoomorphs that occur in surviving arts of the pre-Columbian Caribbean, surveying traditional narratives and other folklore, Caribbean and Amazonian ethnography, ethnozoology, and other disciplines to offer insights into the cultural significance of these animal symbols. In his 2019 book, Pre-Columbian Art of the Caribbean, offered a broad survey over 2 millennia of ceramic, sculptural, architectural, lapidary, equestrian, and body art in the pre-Columbian Antilles. He has recently completed the book Simi, which Lawrence, you have to maybe correct that pronunciation there. Simi, the development, symbolism, and ritual life of Caribbean trigonoliths, which employs a multidisciplinary approach to understanding this unique but enigmatic class of conical art objects found across the islands of the Greater and Lesser Antilles. I also want to mention that Lawrence Professor Waldron comes from an art history background, but he's essentially, we've adopted him as well as an anthropological archaeologist. Now, tonight, Professor Waldron will lecture on Towards an Art Historicization of Pre-Columbian Caribbean Archaeology. So everyone welcome Professor Waldron.
Thanks, Tim. Tim, how's my audio? I'm good?
It sounds great.
Okay. And thank you all for coming. Thanks to AIA for inviting me to do this. I don't know exactly how long my talk takes because I edit my talks up until the last minute. So I'm going to just jump right into it so we'll have time for question and answer. How's that? Am I visible?
Yep, it looks good.
Okay, great. All right. So you heard the title, and what I'd like to do is identify some problems and maybe suggest how we can solve them. But before we go any further, I would suggest, if you're unfamiliar with pre-Columbian Caribbean studies, whether archaeology or any other discipline, maybe you can take a screenshot of this handy chronology and keep it handy. But for the most part, I'll be dwelling in here, the Saladoid, and here, the more familiar Taino eras. Okay, so just giving you 3 seconds to get a capture of that. We date these periods pretty much by their ceramics. which brings some problems of its own. It's a very early 20th century way of dating things archaeologically. Okay, so at any given time in the Caribbean, there are hundreds of archaeologists at work. They're doing nice, systematic excavations, or in a hurry, they're doing mitigations before a developer puts up a hotel. An airport or an airstrip is being built on the site, which is what is about to happen here at this at the site of Argyle on the island of St. Vincent about 10 years ago. They're about to put up an international airport here, and it turns out they're not one, but two sites right on this spot. So this one that really abuts the Caribbean Sea there, actually technically that's the Atlantic Ocean. It's right on the beach, and so they're doing students and professors from University of Leiden are excavating here. And to the left or the west in the photo is another older site that is being excavated by University of Calgary. So that's just to give you a sense that there's a lot of excavation going on in the Caribbean at any given time. But the art historians are AWOL, so there'll be some discussion of that. The Caribbean is very rich in archaeological materials. Your plow digs really nice stuff up by accident when you go farming. You're trying to dig a foundation, or even like you're trying to put in a new cesspool or something for your house, and you're going to be disturbing a site depending on the island. Antigua, which is what you're looking at here, is particularly notorious for having a lot of archaeological material just right under the surface. And Antigua, for example, like many islands in the Eastern Caribbean, has a wonderful ceramic age or ceramic fluorescent presence, but some islands go all the way back many thousands of years to as much as 6,000 BCE. This axe here is actually about 9,000 years old. So all of this archaeological work has generated over at least 100 years of published research. A lot of it peer-reviewed, a lot of it conference proceedings. There have already been 30 biennial congresses of the International Association for Caribbean Archaeology. And before that, there were lots of international archaeologists coming to the region, sort of kickstarting Caribbean archaeology. In addition to that, there have been some art historical publications, if you can call them that, but they're mostly published by museums as exhibition catalogs, which means that they kind of have to hire out the talent to write about this material. Usually, those are going to be archaeologists, and occasionally, they're museum curators, who, of course, are not specialists on pre-Columbian Caribbean material. There is also in these more art historical publications, like you're seeing here on the right, a very distinctive gender bias in the subject matter because it's the axe wielding, canoe making men who make the sculpture, whereas these books tend to gloss over the ceramics, which are so freighted with symbolic information, tend to be almost absent from these books, and ceramics, just from ethnographic analogy, are usually made by women. My books have attempted to correct. These are the two books Tim mentioned earlier. They try to correct this imbalance in the subject matter. The first book is entirely about ceramics, with some comparisons to other materials, and then the second book is this grand 2,000-year survey of pre-Columbian Caribbean art, which has two massive chapters on ceramics. But the question lingers, where are the art historians? Hundreds of archaeologists, count them, two or three art historians. I think the two active ones are actually at this meeting tonight because I see Ruben Balmaceda on the guest list. So if something should happen right now where Zoom becomes impossible and we have no internet connections and we can't talk to each other, an entire industry dies if Ruben and I are walking together and get hit by a bus. So we definitely need more art historians. And the question lingers as to why there are no art historians. I'm going to complicate the question further by pointing out that the Caribbean is not the only region that suffers from this art historical neglect. Colombia also is almost completely ignored by art historians, as is the Amazon. We have scraped the bottom trying to find some art historians who are working on the Amazonian materials for this upcoming panel that we have at the College Art Association, and we could not find one. We found some brilliant archaeologists and anthropologists who were willing to work with us. So, um, and to me, the neglect of the Amazon is particularly egregious because you could just extend Andean studies into the Amazon. After all, the Amazon invented the pottery that ends up trickling up into the Andes. And the Andes, I like to tease the Andeanists that the Andean civilization suffered from feather envy because they import all their feathers, and when they can import feathers, they mimic them in gold. You know, all they have is this gold stuff. So they copy the most brilliant thing they've ever seen, which is tropical feathers in gold. So um, Amazon is particularly mysterious to me, but I think we should try to tackle this question just a little bit tonight. Like, why are the art historians missing? Let's get rid of the first argument right away. We can just collectively roll our eyes at this, that there's no artistry in these regions, so there's no need for art historians. The other one that we could propose is there's a lack of precious materials, and art historians are attracted by shiny things. Obviously, I'm teasing the art historians. I am one. I think I'm in a position to ridicule the art historians a little bit here. And I think when we see things like this from the Isthmian region, which created its own gold rush during the Gilded Age, where people were actually either exporting, smuggling these objects out of the country or melting them down into, I don't know, ingots or whatever to put in the bank in London and Paris. When we see that there was so much gold material coming out of here, we realize, well, that can't be the explanation. That the reason the Amazon, Isthmian region, and Amazonia Orinoquia, which I have turned into the acronym AIAO, that can't be the reason that these regions are being neglected. So what else might it be? Um, if we ask ourselves, if we continue asking ourselves these questions, we might say, well, these places don't have large monuments and they don't have urbanism, what I call in quotes absence of ruins, which I borrowed from the title of a Jamaican novel. This absence of ruins theory also doesn't obtain because it turns out there are lots of ruins buried under the jungle in the Amazon that turns out to have had like forest kingdoms, just like Mesoamerica did. And what that set off, the LIDAR explorations of Stefan Rostam, my colleague from South American Studies, is an argument over what constitutes urbanism? Like, should we really call it urbanism if we've got a cluster of structures with causeways leading out of them? Some of the causeways wide enough to land two Cessna planes, wingtip to wingtip. What constitutes urbanism? And so Stefan Rostan's LIDAR findings in the urban Amazon have touched off this kind of debate. So if we at least entertain Rostin and his colleagues' findings about Amazonian urbanism, it would seem that that's not an explanation either for why art historians are neglecting this place. We could suggest other things that I think make more sense, like the pathway dependencies of the Mesoamericanists and Andinists. Pathway dependency is not quite a rut. It's when you've made a groove for a particular career choice and you're sticking to it. It's kind of hard to get out of it because all of your decisions have kind of led to this. We've got PhD programs that are creating Mesoamericanists and Andinists. And so in these programs, it's very difficult to depart for the Amazon, Isthmo-Columbia, or the Antilles. And do you have a specialist in your department who could test students on that and recommend readings to students on that? And so the universities are kind of in a groove that they can't seem to get out of. Another theory is that these regions are extremely complex in terms of the number of ethnicities, the number of languages that are in them, especially the Amazon, but also Isthmo-Columbia and to a lesser extent the Antilles. And then we've got not only a lot of cultural and linguistic diversity, but we've also got societies that are arranged in ways that don't quite fit our neat little categories of what is a chiefdom, what is a kingdom, what is an empire, what is a city-state. And so all of these categories get challenged by this, by these societies that are in these regions. And just like the argument over urbanism, we find ourselves arguing over exactly what is a chiefdom, what is a kingdom. The Aztecs, for instance, were not really a regular empire. They were like a tribute empire. The Inca are more like an empire, but the Aztec structure is a little different. So pre-Columbian societies very often challenge our nice, cozy categories that we very happily apply to Asian cultures and other global North cultures almost as well as we did to European ones. But pre-Columbian America comes with some challenges to our categories. So the art historians have a lot to do if they would ever join the game. Like I say, the archaeologists have showed up. They're doing their work. In fact, they're a little overwhelmed, and so the art historians are needed here to do very close visual scrutiny of these artifacts that are sitting in drawers. They've been seen 3 or 4 times by the archaeologists who excavated them, by a couple of scholars who've come to visit them, usually archaeologists, and maybe a Native American group who's come to visit their patrimony. And then no art historians till someone like myself or Ruben shows up. So this square here identifies this little guy who needs to be singled out and studied as an art object. When we see all the work that went into the portrayal here, we know there's something to reckon with here. And this is the case with all of the motifs that you see in this drawer. They all require decipherment. If you see a saladoid red on a white on red pot, you realize it's speaking to you in a kind of learned language of motifs that needs to be deciphered. And I already know that that's going to be the rest of my life as long as I live, is deciphering these motifs, actually. And the difference between archaeology and art history is kind of based on stereotypes of the two professions. Like I was just teasing about the art historians. I know the stereotype of art historians is that, we walk around museums looking at Michelangelo using words like sublime and stuff. But the stereotype of the art historian has a little bit of truth, and then mostly it's not so true. And really, the way we think about these things is that, look, archaeology is quantitative, whereas art history is qualitative. Archaeology is science, and art history is liberal arts. And archaeology is about hard facts, and art history is about, like ideas. And really, um, well, especially in the post-processual archaeology, we find that archaeologists have had to reckon with the fact that you can't reproduce an excavation. So technically, it's not like an experiment, and you're more like a social science and a natural science. And then there's a lot of interpretation involved and context. And you start sounding a lot like we art historians, who you think play fast and loose with your sigma numbers on your on the testing of the age of artifacts and so on. So yes, we do kind of estimate things because we're looking at periods of people more or less who are a community of practice. And art historians tend to move in a more interpretive space than many dirt archaeologists, but the two categories do not have hard edges. So, in seeing the artifact as art, what we're doing is looking for the psychological and the intellectual content in the artifact. And anthropologists do this, and art historians do this using close visual scrutiny of the artifact. This is just photos from my field work. My doctoral field work involved me going to a lot of collections and photographing um, very symbolically freighted objects one by one and considering each one separately instead of as part of an assay or part of an assemblage. I consider that too, but I'm considering some of the problem solving and technical decisions that an artisan or artist is making when they make an image, when they make an object. So I'm looking at morphology, I'm looking at color choices, I'm looking at motifs, and so on. But art is kind of a vague category for many people. In fact, I remember being cornered by a philosophy professor who asked me to define art, and it was in the men's room of all places. And I said, well, we don't really like to define art in our department because every time you define it, some kind of art comes along and challenges your previous definition. And he says, well, you guys are a whole department and you can't define yourselves. I mean, you get paid and you can't define what you get paid for. And so I went home and I wrote up this definition um, just to quiet this philosophy professor down. And it came out like this very legalistic thing that I have on the screen right now, which is that art is any object, performance, or space which is which was made, so it involves human decision making, to have as its function, or at least as a major part of its function, to be considered on aesthetic grounds or on its aesthetic merits. And what does the word aesthetic mean? Well, if you look it up in a dictionary, the dictionary is going to say something about ideals of beauty, but that's a very narrow definition of aesthetics, mostly based on like Renaissance through early modern art and maybe Chinese and Islamic art. They're also very concerned with beauty. But there's lots of art that's not concerned with beauty that we know as art because it's a visual expression, it's an image, and we suspect that it has some kind of meaning. So then we could define the word aesthetic as a kind of sensory ideal for a manufactured thing, whatever that thing might be. Again, it might be an object, a performance, or a space. So it's a kind of ideal. If you're in cooking school, it's not only a visual ideal, it's also an olfactory ideal. It's also a gustatory ideal. How good does it smell, taste, look? And in visual arts, obviously, that's a visual ideal. So I don't know if you can keep this whole legalistic definition of art in your mind, but I think you can do it. And so hold it there as we look at some other images. While I was photographing this image, I realized that it cast a shadow that told me something that I already knew, that it's representing an owl. I mean, it's covered in big eyes that are telling you, I am the seer. I see. I am about seeing. But it's also shaped like an owl, and actually, it's two owl ear tufts. If you see them from above, they're two little faces, and they're actually bat faces. And bats and owls are often, they're not conflated in pre-Columbian Caribbean art. Bats and owls are seen as related. They're both night flyers. They're seen as relatives, or in one Amazonian case, in-laws, because they marry into each other's families. Like the sloth is the monkey's grandfather, is how the interpretation is. So the shadow tells you owl, but actually the pot is an owl, and then the shadow is an inverted version of that. And I want you now to just imagine looking at this thing, not lit by the fluorescent bulbs of the Yale Peabody Museum collection, but by flickering firelight. And so art historical interpretation does kind of consider what is the phenomenology of this object? How do people interact with this thing and under what conditions? And yes, this shadow would be dancing back and forth, and sometimes it would be owl, and sometimes it would be bat, and it would be sort of combining those two symbolisms in one. Owls are also considered messengers of the afterlife in the ancient Caribbean, and bats are their conveyance from the afterlife. The dead sometimes take the form of bats to fly out of the island of the dead to visit the islands of the living, where they take human form again, spend a night, and return as bats back to the island of the dead. So the two zoomorphs, I should say, are very closely related. Some of my first and preliminary research into this kind of deep scrutiny that helps with the interpretation of objects was with the little decorated doodads that are on the sides of pots, usually at the handle where you grab them to pick them up, where you interact with the pot. And a lot of those adornos, as they are called, are zoomorphic. And it turns out there are over 25 animals, that recognizable species that are represented on these pots from the Saladoid era at the dawn of the Common Era to the Taino just before the arrival of Columbus. And then there's a whole plethora of these kinds of fanciful creatures that you can't identify from real life. So there are turtles, pelicans, armadillos, anteaters, vultures, and these tend to be more in the Eastern Caribbean, where those animals are vagrant from South America or have been introduced by humans. There are lots of different birds. There are crocodilians. Occasionally, you'll find a monkey. There are some animals. There's some islands that are obsessed with manatees, and other islands that don't care at all. Dolphins are pretty rare. Lots of parrots in the Eastern Caribbean, especially, and lots of dogs who are like your hunting dog. The dogs guide you to the underworld, to the afterlife. They walk out in front of you just like on a hunting expedition. So all these animals, I had to figure out what do they mean, and how did people interact with the vessels that bore their likeness. And so, art historians, being the visual scrutiny people, there's a lot of cataloging of what makes it a dog and not a possum. What makes it a possum and not an armadillo? And then there's a lot of scrutiny of the slight style differences from island to island. Crocodiles presented some particular problems that were hard to solve because the images of crocodiles on islands where crocodiles don't occur seem to be based on verbal descriptions of the animal rather than seeing the animal. And while looking at all these adornos, I realize when you turn the pot, the Adorno changes, which is why they're made in this stylized, sort of modular way. They're made up of components like a Mr. Potato Head, so that you can turn it and see something different, and that's very, very much deliberate. So there's this polymorphism that results in these ambigrams. So you see this pot from the side, and you see a long-necked bird, probably a heron or an egret, most likely a heron. But when you see it from above, it becomes a face with two eyes, a nose, and a mouth, with a crown on top with the central projection of feathers, like you see in Amazonian crowns. Caribbean people also wore their crowns like that. But when you see it slightly at an angle, you also realize, oh, it's a turtle. There are the turtle flippers, and that's the turtle's carapace, and the face is the design on the carapace. And in addition to that, when you turn the pot, you see a little bird on the other side, and you wonder what he's doing there. And so when I throw in these images, it becomes easier to see that a thing that's a bird head is also well, they don't have, they're very egalitarian in this period, so they probably don't have chiefs, but they wear their feathers on special occasions. And the crowned person is also sort of ambigram with the turtle. And turtles are supremely symbolic of the first Antillians, like in a great migration into the islands. And the little songbird actually links to the long-necked bird because there is a traditional narrative in the Amazon, which probably was also told in the Caribbean, of the first acquisition of tobacco. A long-necked bird flew a very long distance to the Isle of Only Women, where they grew the tobacco. And at that point, he deployed the tiny hummingbird to go and acquire the tobacco seeds because the hummingbird could not fly the long distances that he could. And the hummingbird is a very quick and skillful flyer, which he would need on the island of women only, the Amazonian island, because those women are extremely skillful archers, and the hummingbird is the only one who could escape them. So there's a traditional narrative behind this pot, as far as we know. These are just other examples of how it's a face on top, but it's a turtle on the side. And so the benefits of the visual scrutiny in the collection where these objects are visited quite infrequently is that we start finally being able to interpret some of these objects. In this case, owl's face looks out at you, but the owl's beak is actually a turtle. And so, as we turn these vessels around the fire at night, they're not just conversation pieces, they become like mnemonic devices to trigger traditional narratives. While staring at these pots as well, we start picking up other things about the people. in that they have 3 or 4 different kinds of symmetry that involve reflection, gliding, rotation. And so all of these different kinds of symmetry, we don't know exactly what they mean, but we definitely get a sense that these folks are very much preoccupied with complementarity of opposites. Even in their color choices, you see that that's something that they're concerned with. But these were very vague concerns compared to some other ones that I'll show you before I conclude. Um, as art historians, we're also very concerned with technique. And I have a studio background, as Tim gave in my biography. So I'm very interested in the problem solving and the decision making that artists make. And I can see the painter's hand go from this circle that she's made across here with the white slip to join this other circle that she's made. And this red area is a dropout. The pot is red first with white painted on top of it. Here, the dropout is the buff clay around which she's painted. So she's created a motif in the negative space. Negative space is supremely important. Well, I shouldn't say supremely important. It's equally important with positive space in these ceramics where the complementarity is so much part of the image. Think yin yang. And again, while staring at these pots that are just sitting in collections, we realize, there's a major change from Euclidean geometry to these organic forms between the Saladoid and the Taino period. They go from making these very rational forms, the cylinder, the cone, to making these sort of wobbly vessels that they sag in the middle and then they tighten up where you grab them to carry them. And it's not as if the skill at making rational forms has been lost. They're perfectly capable of doing it. Taino potters made this one, but they much prefer to make these. So it's a kind of Baroque embracing of the organic forms that's happened in response to what their ancestors used to do, even though I should tell you, all of these motifs on here are actually Saladoid motifs that the Taino remember, and they might have the same meaning for them, or they might have assigned them new meaning, but they've put them on a different morphology of vessel. Okay, and this is just another example of that. I mean, these are pretty spectacular, so I had to show them to you. But I've pretty much made my point about Euclidean versus organic. And in fact, this vessel has a phallic spout and mammiform chambers, which are the 2 parts of the body that create white life-giving substances. Probably a wedding vessel, that one. And the ancient Antilleans are one of the few ancient peoples who are actually very concerned with facial expression. Most ancient art and even medieval art all over the world, people get their settled face on, what New Yorkers call your subway face. It's just like, don't bother me. I don't want to talk to you. It becomes like this very serious face, which is why the Mona Lisa smile is so enigmatic to us, because most of those ancient depictions of human beings have no emotion on the face. But Taino art and even Saladoid art before it is very interested in facial expressions. And, if you just do like a passing glance or have a passing interest in this material, you might think, well, he looks like he's grinning or smiling. But you'd be in the minority there, even amongst the archaeologists who have been looking at objects like this for a long time, but not necessarily stopping to interpret them very deeply. Even they would agree with the art historians that no, he's not smiling. If you combine the fact that he's got this cadaverous physique with all his bones showing, but as cadaverous as he has this staunch erection, and then his eyes are tearing, and he's got all of these elite kinds of regalia on, like the large ear spools and the ligatures. If you combine all of those things with the fact that he's made out of the most holy kind of wood in the Caribbean, guayacan or ironwood, then it starts occurring to you, I think he's some kind of holy guy, probably a shaman. And yeah, when you administer the entheogen cohoba to yourself or someone blows it into your nose, your eyes go all saucer-like and you start to cry. In fact, your nose begins to run and your body starts being racked by this discomfort, which makes you grimace. Um, on, However, some scholars have suggested, well, how do you know he's grimacing? And I've just pointed out to you, this is how we know he's grimacing. Ethnographic analogy and early Spanish chronicles tell us that shamans under the influence of cohoba, which is Anadenanthera peregrina. It's what they use at Tiwanaku. People under the influence of this narcotic, they are known to have these kinds of problems with their bodily fluids, and it's very uncomfortable. And there are lots of images of racked shamans, exhausted shamans, just bereft shamans looking into the void in Taino art. And in this very special one, the face was actually hidden. Now the arm is broken, but the face was actually down on the arm. So the potter, she carved the whole face only to cover it with arms. But now that the arms are broken, we can see the face a little better. And this is a shaman that's just finished the journey and come back and given the answers to the community and can barely hold on anymore. And shamans are famous for fasting, which is why you see these very deep hollows in their hips. So, as a case in point, I thought I would conclude by a sort of demonstration of what this visual scrutiny of the art historians can bring to the archaeological material. And it has directly to do with this upcoming book that Tim told you about, which is The Development, Significance, and Ritual Lives of Trigonal Semis, which are these mysterious conical objects that we find all over the Caribbean except in Trinidad and Cuba. And the reason for that is probably that the phenomenon started somewhere in the center of the archipelago and spread out and hadn't quite reached those two most outer islands by the time of the conquest. So the religion was still spreading. It was already more than 1,500 years old and was still spreading very slowly across the archipelago, and Columbus shut that down. Jamaica also has very no evidence of this religion, but most of the other islands do. But you hear me call them trigonal semis. What is a semi? Some of you, even if you're not Caribbeanists, you already know this word just from living in the United States, where there are lots of Puerto Ricans who very often make reference to it. There are four classes of a semi, which are overlapping. A nature spirit can be a semi, or a god is a semi. Um, a deified ancestor. Ancestors become deified after they die. They can be semi. A semi can be an idol, which is not an icon. It's an object that embodies a spirit. So the object is the spirit. Very often, well, we have traditional narratives surviving that tell us that sometimes a Taino person would see an object acting strangely and would call a shaman, and the shaman would interpret, would communicate with the object, and the object from nature, the biofact or geofact from nature, like a tree or a rock or a piece of coral, would say, carve me into the form of such and such. And so that is a verified idol. It's not just an icon, which is the fourth category, which is an object that visually represents the deity. So, what does the word semi actually mean translated directly from Taino Arawakan? It means something like sweet, but I suspect what it means is ineffable or filled with some kind of activating flavor of some kind. And so that's the etymological origin of the word, but it means so much more, as you can see from this slide that I've compiled from studying all the different kinds of semi. And it so happens that trigonal semi, there are at least 11 or 12 different types. People look at them and speculate what they might mean, but you should really look at all the types before you make a decision about that. And they start out being very small ones, like you see here, that are actually broken off of the tops of conch shells. They're the crenellations or the tubercles on conch shells, and sometimes the apices as well. And for a while, they stay like that. Like for 500 years, they're just these tiny, beautifully carved objects that people probably carried with them. But when they break out of just using the shell and start using stones, usually something in the limestone family, the semi start growing. As a matter of fact, the first thing they tried after shell was coral. And what coral and shell have in common is the material they're made out of, calcium carbonate, which when you carve the material and it turns to slurry because you're using an abrasive method, which is wet it, grind it to create the pattern, what you get is this white, milky, slimy substance, which can easily be linked from all that Levi-Strauss we've read to reproductive substances like semen and milk. So the material symbolism there is that this is a life-giving thing, which is probably why they jumped from shell to coral and then to limestone. And once they jumped to limestone, the semi started getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they started being used in public worship, run by chiefs, not just in private devotion. And this is how they started out, as these little things over here, sawed off. And on the underside of each one, because it's cut off of a growing thing, it's got this little spiral hollow underneath. That spiral hollow, that plantar hollow or plantar void, is never going to go away, even when they switch to coral and all different kinds of calcium-based stones. That's never going to go away, which is why you always see a little sort of shadow underneath them, is because they've put in the trouble of carving the recess on the bottom. And I'll show you that in a minute, but what I'm showing you here is what is the image that's carved on a lot of them, if not most of them, is the image of the frog. Frog knees, frog elbows, hollow of frog hips, other frog leg going around the other side. When you see it from above, it looks like this. It resolves into a labyrinth. It's put on petroglyphs. It's put on the mouths of vessels. It's carved onto furniture. It's painted on the side of vessels, not just carved. It's everywhere. The frog is a symbol of the rainy season and the fertility that it brings. And so we shouldn't be surprised that the frog symbol is kind of labyrinthine. If you really want to see more images of that, you can come to our College Art Association panel next month. But my theory of that is that it's meant to look like a ripple. It's meant to look like a ripple caused by a raindrop. When we find images of trigonal semis out in nature in the Rupestrian art, we find that, oh, they've got something on them that can't be carved on a stone or a shell or coral version. They've got a kind of stellar symbol on top of them, probably the sun, but we can't be absolutely sure. And so if they attempted to put that finial up here, it will break off. So they don't bother with that. But apparently everyone understands these objects as having this stellar symbol on top of them, which would seem to suggest that trigonal semis represent mountains or islands with the sun on top of them. And I'll tell you why I think that in a minute. Here's some reckoning with the plantar hollow or the plantar void, even on ones that are made out of calcium again, bone, which is what this one is made out of, have either a drilled or a carved hollow underneath them. So they never let go of that idea of the elliptical cone with a hollow underneath it. This hollow has never been considered by anyone studying trigonal semis for any period of time. It's time to deal with it. In fact, on a petroglyph in St. John, in the Virgin Islands, there is an image of a Form 7 um, petroglyph, Form 7 trigonal semi. This is Form 7, it's a triple peak. And so here's a triple peaked one with the stellar symbol above it and a hollow underneath that seems to be vertically communicating that water is coming out of there. It almost comes off like a cloud with the sun above it and rain falling from it. It looks almost like a glyph from Mesoamerica. And so it looks like what this hollow represents is some kind of store of water that is inside the mountain. And look, lots of people in the Amazon, where the Antillians are originally from, believe in a triple-decker world of the starry overworld, the earthly world in which we live, and the watery underworld. But as mainlanders, they kind of conceive of the land as being atop the water, whereas in the Antilles, there is a very clear perception that the islands continue down under the water because people go diving for their food all the time, for their conch shells, as for their conch, as a matter of fact. And they know that what the islands are inundated mountains. In fact, their traditional narratives say that one of their ancient culture heroes accidentally flooded the world, and that's how the Antilles were created. So they know this. They do not think that the land is on top of the water. They think the land continues below the water. And so this idea of the water stored up inside of the land seems to be sort of from the peaks catching the clouds and gathering water, and from the under part of the island soaking up the water and creating a store of water for the people. And it turns out lots of mainland native peoples have this same concept. The Tepital is the mountain with the cave inside that is a water source. And the step fret in the Andes, which we also find in Mesoamerica, is an abstract rendition of the mountain with a cave underneath. And sometimes it is rendered thus with a spiral that seems to reflect that there's water inside, as you see here. We find this emblem all over Andean art. We find this emblem with some continuity before the Aztecs, but the Aztecs, of course, the Mexica make it famous. And so this concept seems to be what the triconal semi are expressing in their very island sort of way. And so the trigonal semi is a kind of deified island with a water source inside of it that provides for the people. And this is why they very often put human and animal faces on the trigonal semi because they're representing um, sort of personified islands or parts. That's what I really think, parts of islands that they come from. And so I'll conclude by saying that the what I've just demonstrated to you is what art historians bring to pre-Columbian Caribbean studies. But long before I started doing what I do, archaeologists were there on the job in droves, as reliable as the waves with those yearly field seasons doing their work. And art historians have been nowhere to be found, helping on sort of like a rear guard, helping with the interpretation of these objects. And so it's time for the art historians to grab their machetes and beat a path through all of this archaeological data that's been piling up steadily over 100 years. There is so much work to do. And there are just like two or three people doing it. And I thought I would end with this image by pointing out that archaeologists and art historians are both created at the museum. The general public can't even tell us apart. You realize that, right? That in pre-Columbian studies, the general public does not know the difference between an archaeologist and an art historian. And yet, inside of our disciplinary silos, we feel very different amongst ourselves. And it's really time to start using each other's data, considering each other's interests when we do our work so that we can create a kind of collaborative art history that Mesoamericanists and Andeanists already know quite well. I do not think that Tim Pugh can conceive of a world in which there is no art historian like Mary Miller, the Mayanist. And yet, Caribbean archaeologists have been laboring for 100 years without any knowledge that art historians might be out there wanting to do this kind of work. So it's time to, I guess, cross our machetes and get some work done. So I'll conclude there. Hahom is how we say thank you in the Taino language. And I say thank you from the land of the Lenape here in New York. I'm in a place called Jamaica, Queens, which means land of waters in the Lenape language. So I've brought these two traditions together in a place called Jamaica. Thanks, folks.
Thank you, Lawrence. Anyway, so we have a number of questions here. I have questions for you, but I'll save mine if there's no time. But we'll just go down through them until, well, just as long as we think.
Okay, sorry I ran a little long.
No, well, it was interesting, so I didn't notice at all if you did. So first question is, why do archaeologists not have the same hurdles as art historians? The hurdles that you mentioned earlier about dealing with the chiefdoms and the what is a city, what is not a city.
Why do archaeologists not have those same hurdles? I think archaeologists had those hurdles earlier along, and like I said, Rostan's findings activated a whole new debate about what is urban. So there's still a lot of infighting in both of the disciplines. And so I don't want to speculate about why something happens in the archaeological community. I feel like an archaeologist should answer that.
I can mention that actually B. Gordon Child, the
Mhm.
Maya for him was kind of anomalous because he didn't think that their cities were cities, but so that this issues it does we do deal with this.
Right.
Okay, so Pam Crabtree and some other people really liked your definition of art. Okay, here's another question. How do Mesoamerican art theories translate to these areas? Wait, oh yeah, what do how do you think that Mesoamerica applies to the Caribbean? Like the
Well,
theories that we have. Yeah.
I always feel like behind that question is a question about connections, and the two regions definitely knew each other. They had contacts with each other. Um, I would like to take that question as an opportunity to tell you something about people who speak the Arawakan language. Um, Look, language is not culture. Uh, I speak English, but I'm not an Englishman. But because I speak English, I've got all of this Anglo-Saxon stuff in my head that has passed along the language. I don't, because I'm from the formerly British West Indies, I don't just know Robin Hood. I know Dick Turpin. I was hooked on Dick Turpin as a kid, who's kind of like a Robin Hood character. I know a lot more Shakespeare than I know anything about African folk tales, which is obviously part of my ancestry. I know more Shakespeare than I know Voltaire, right? So, um, languages are vectors for culture if they're not exactly the same as culture. They're definitely correlated. And Arawakan people generally, people who speak the Arawakan language, they have a curious behavior that they exhibit very often is that they so very much know who they are that when they interact with other cultures, not only do they stay how they are, but they often reassert what it means to be them. And we have lots of examples of Arawakan people in the Amazon interacting with the Andeans. In fact, Arawakans seem to have been in charge of trade with the Andes. And in the Caribbean, the Arawakan people are going back and forth to the Maya world all the time. And look at how they maintain their social structure even after contacts with the Andeans and the Maya. They maintain their chiefdom structures with just two or three different classes. They maintain their kind of middling interest in guanine or like gold copper alloy. They always share the Maya's love of jade. And in fact, my talk at CAA next month will be about jade frogs in the ancient Antilles. The meaning of jade is very similar, and jade too is related to water. And so they have some commonalities with the Mesoamerican people, but they maintain their difference. They maintain that this is how we are, that's how you are. We love certain things that you have. We would like to acquire them. Like the jade, for instance, the jade from the Caribbean might, some of it might be from Dominican Republic and Cuba, but a lot of it has been sourced on a molecular level to what looks like the Motagua Valley in Guatemala. So there's definitely some exchange there, and one of the Taino shamans are very gaunt because they fast, but just before they take jojoba, they also vomit themselves. And a Caribbean emetic wand or vomit spatula was excavated at Altunja in the Maya world. So we know the Maya are getting things from the Caribbean and sending things there. The Caribbean people are getting things from Mesoamerica and trading things there. So I'll just leave it like that. The Arawakans maintain a kind of difference. They're actually quite proud of who they are. And so the some of the categories that we use to talk about Mesoamerica will not apply in the Caribbean because the Arawakan people insist on their difference.
Okay. So, okay, art history privileges certain categories of objects. Ceramics and figurines often fall between disciplinary cracks, often neglected, deemed too aesthetic for focus by archaeologists and too archaeological for art historians. Your focus
Right.
bridges not only gender preferences for male-made sculptures with less represented women's objects, but also the delineation of academic fields.
Yeah. So that's more comment than question. I totally agree with that. And I want to soften these boundaries between the academic fields. I want to soften the boundaries between what's a chiefdom and a kingdom? The Spaniards called the Taino caciques kings. They did not call them chiefs. We come along later and we do what in our mind is a downgrade to chiefs.
Mm.
And so all of these categories need to be loosened up. In fact, one of the things I noticed while preparing this presentation is that the art historians, look, art historians in the 1990s, it was very fashionable for them to say, well, how do we know that culture even has a concept of art? Should we be studying it as art when in fact most cultures have a concept of this is visual, it communicates, it requires a certain amount of skill and vision. And so we were expecting other cultures to be so alien that they didn't have a concept of art. And that turned out to we were missing the inclusion for the diversity. We were we were expecting human beings to be so alien in their difference that we didn't realize, oh no, these categories they overlap all the time, and we just need to expand our definition of art. So the art historians need to expand and soften their edges. Archaeologists have to do so as well. We both have to insist on certain things being in our publications. And so that's why I think our collaboration is overdue in these three neglected areas: Antilles, Isthmus, Amazonia, Orinoco.
So how were the traditional stories preserved or resurrected?
So we have art from the Saladoid era that confirms traditional narratives from the Taino era, which is a 2,000 year span on the beginning and end side. And so it would seem that the traditional narratives were maintained by people who are well trained in reciting them, maybe singing them. And like I said, I found some evidence that even some zoomorphs were depicted using visual descriptions rather than actually seeing the animal. So their oral tradition seems to have been so strong that it actually it prevented some of the degradation that happens like in a game of telephone. And so they seem to have maintained 14 to 1800-year-old stories till Columbus, on his second journey, goes back to Spain, leaves a Hieronymite monk named Ramon Panay to write down as much as he can of the traditions of the Taino people before Admiral Columbus gets back on his third journey. And so we have this little skinny book in which Panay complains about running out of paper. He uses up paper to complain that he's running out of paper, in which he recounts some of these traditional narratives, and he recounts some of them pretty badly because his just recently Spanish, now recently Renaissance mind cannot quite understand like cyclical notions of time and the way that native peoples count, and it creates a lot of difficulties for him. So reading his book, Account of the Antiquities of the Indians, the first ethnology written in the Americas, I guess, in a European language. Reading his book is practically a form of archaeology. There's a lot of excavation going on trying to get facts and likelihoods out of what he wrote. So in the end, there it's written down, but over a millennium before that, it was spoken by the people according to probably some kind of strict rule.
A number of comments. Thank you. The sound of the coquis sounds so evocative of Puerto Rico. Um,
Hawaiians. The coquille has
and
been accidentally introduced to Hawaii, and Hawaiians cannot sleep now because they're hearing all night, whereas in the Caribbean, that lulls us off to sleep. That's a lullaby for us. And that's the
Okay,
frog that's referenced in the art.
I think this is going to have to be our last question, unless you want to keep going. But okay, from Matt Riley here. Thanks so much, Lawrence. Very much appreciate how you engage with archaeologists, including through the IACA. You mentioned that CMEs don't make it to places like Cuba and
Trinidad.
Trinidad, because the practices don't get there. However, we know that there are loads of interaction between those islands and the Central Caribbean through ceramics, isotopes, fauna, and so on. Could there be
Definitely.
another explanation for why CMEs do not show up there? Some sort of cultural refusal?
Yeah, it's definitely that there is the populations in Trinidad and Cuba are also technically more diverse and more ancient. Trinidad and Cuba have populations that go back 6 to 8,000 years ago. And so those folks, even when they're mixed with Arawakan folks, their cultural interests are different. And so I do think there is some cultural resistance going on in some of the islands, but I do think there's a chronological spread that might have eventually not only taken over Trinidad, but started seeping into the very ancient homeland of Venezuela, given time, because there are some trade trigonal semis found in Trinidad. So we know there's lots of contact between them. We find Trinidadian pitch from the pitch lake inside of ceramic vessels in Guadeloupe, which is like 15 major islands away. And so there is a lot of contact, but there is a lot of religious diversity in the Caribbean, if I can call them religions in our sense. There's a religious minority in Eastern Puerto Rico and Vieques who their diet is different. They have some of the same sacred animals, but they have a lot more drug paraphernalia. And it's very obvious that their idea of their religion is very different. In fact, it might be a different religion, and they have one zoomorph that no one else has in the Caribbean, and it's a condor from Central America. And that's the Huecoid culture. We don't know exactly what to call them, but we used to think they were some kind of special branch of the Saladoid. They're not. They're a separate culture. Even their coprolites show that they eat different foods and have different pathologies. So the Caribbean has some little pockets where people are like, no, I have my own thing. I don't need your thing. And so, yes, there may have been some resistance there. I would like to say this last thing about the region, though. It is not because they're islands that they're isolated. An island is a place that you could turn into isolation if you want, but the islands are all connected by the sea. Very often, people are married to a guy or a gal right across the water on the other island because they don't even speak to people on the other side of their own island. There's a lot of connectivity there. So when people choose not to adopt the trigonal semi faith, it is partially because of some kind of cultural resistance or refusal, as you put it. But I think it would have taken over in the end. It
I
seems
just
quite
read.
dynamic and it was spreading really fast.
Can I just read one more?
Sure,
And this will be it. Okay, just
sure.
because it's very relevant to the talk. I feel like some of the artificial divisions between intellectual disciplines are often learned prejudices instilled in undergraduates. When I was an undergraduate many years ago, there was a half joking, half serious rivalry between New World archaeologists who worked out of the anthropology department and the Old World archaeologists in the classics department. The anthro
Wow.
folks called the classic is armchair archaeologists, and the classic is called the anthro folks bean counters. Art historians were just ancillary. I
Right.
never understood the divide, and my forays into the New World disciplines in the art history department only gave me greater understanding, showing me new ways looking at at the Bronze Age archaeological materials I was studying.
That sounds completely familiar to me from within the art department. And when I was a studio artist in undergrad, we had the same kinds of divisions. The painters did not even speak to the illustrators because illustrators paint and draw on deadline for money. They're like blue collar workers, but we are the spiritual painters. And so there seem to be these kinds of divisions within our disciplines. And now here I come saying, can we soften the edges on our discipline so we can work with another discipline? And so I know this is very difficult to do. But if we read each other's published work without necessarily interacting, we'll begin to pick up some of the ideas from the other discipline and know what the other discipline can contribute to us and what the other discipline might actually um, be expecting from our research. Because if an archaeologist knows that an art historian wants to know which direction that was facing when it was excavated, where was it in relation to the chief's house, which very often ends up in their field notes anyway, but very often they don't publish that stuff because it gets deprioritized in the final publication. So if you know that art historians are waiting to hear certain kinds of information, or as an art historian, you know the archaeologists are not going to be happy with these very vague dates, then we all we tighten up our discipline by actually loosening its borders. We actually become more rigorous by contending with other kinds of intellects who are reading our material, our productions.
Well, there's actually, the number of thank yous, and someone asked if this would be published online. This talk is being recorded and would be published on the AI site. So thank you very much, Lawrence. That was great.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks everybody for coming as well.